church? I think we don't need children. He's asleep. I tell you what, I'll try not to get too loud and won't wake him, okay? Awesome. How about that? Well, good morning again.
Good morning.
Good morning.
See, told you to do something. Oh, me. Forgot water. This morning, Miss Walker brought me a card, and I was not expecting it, and I just wanted to say thank you to the church for that. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. Thank y'all so much. You don't have to do stuff like that for me, but it really means a lot when you do, and I appreciate it. Thank you. This morning, I want to talk about something that we've all done, and I think I have a lot to talk about this morning. So if we go past 12 o'clock, I apologize, but sometimes it just be that way. The thing I want to talk about this morning, we've all done it, and I think sometimes we even do it to a point that we probably don't even realize that we're doing it. And honestly, I think we've gotten pretty good at it. And I'm talking to myself too this morning because I've gotten good at it as well. From even the small things in my life that we're going to talk about today. So I don't want to give it away just yet. But the Bible is full of people, just like you and me, that doing this particular thing that we're going to talk about today. And as a matter of fact, the first person to ever do it was the first person that God ever created, and that was Adam, and he did it in as early as Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis chapter 3, it says, and I'm just going to say what it says, and then we'll talk about it. It says, the man replied, the man being Adam, "It was the woman you gave who gave it to me, or gave the fruit to me, and I ate it." And then it doesn't stop there, because the very next verse, as Adam is putting the blame on Eve, Eve says in Genesis 3:13, "Then the Lord God asked the woman, 'What have you done?' 'The serpent deceived me,' she replied. 'That's why I ate the fruit.'" That's why I ate it. If you hadn't figured it out by now, I'm talking about making excuses. It's a hard thing to talk about, especially when I make more than my fair share. But I think sometimes it's something that needs to be talked about, because it literally starts in Genesis chapter 3 and goes on through the Bible. There's a lot of people in the Bible that makes excuses. Here's just a few examples. The first one I'm going to talk about today is Moses. My goodness, Moses was a mighty man of God. He was. And the Bible just doesn't say that he made one excuse, documents 5. The first one, now if you didn't know who Moses was, or he was basically born as an Israelite. He's an Israelite. He was, at the time when he was born, they were killing all the newborn boys. So his mother hid him in a basket and put him in the Nile River, and he was found. And the princess pretty much raised him. She adopted him as her own. So Moses was raised as pretty much an Egyptian prince. Had all the luxuries and everything that the typical Egyptian royalty would have. But that didn't last long, because Moses eventually saw what was happening to his people. He killed an Egyptian overseer, got scared, and he fled. And at this particular point in Moses' life, God appeared to him in a burning bush. So I don't know about you guys. I've never seen a burning bush before. I don't hope I do, because it might scare me. That's kind of a scary thing. As a matter of fact, God told Moses, "Don't be afraid." And God called Moses right there. He said, "You're going to go rescue my people from slavery." And not one time, not 2 times, but 5 times Moses came up with an excuse on why he couldn't go do what God called him to do. The first one, Exodus 3, chapter 11. It said, "But Moses protested to God." He said, "Who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people out of Israel?" the second excuse. Exodus 3:13, 2 verses later. But Moses protested, if I go to the people of Israel and tell them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they will ask what his name. Then what should I tell them? The third one, Exodus 4, chapter 1. But Moses protested again. In other words, Moses came up with another excuse. He says, what if they don't believe me or listen to me? What if they say the Lord has never appeared to you? We get into Moses' fourth excuse. Now I like this one, because at this point right here, Moses has stopped protesting. And if you see the third word here, it says in Exodus 4, chapter 10, it says, but Moses pleaded. Have we ever been there with God? Oh yeah, I have. It says, Moses pleaded with the Lord. Oh Lord, I am not very good with words. Right here. I never have been, and I'm not now, even though you have spoken to me. Moses' excuse was basically slapping God in the face, saying, even though you've spoken to me and given me the ability to do what you need me to go do, I can't do it. Come on. He said, I get tongue-tied, and my words get tangled. Man, if there was anyone ever like Moses in that aspect, it's this guy right here. Right here. Oh my goodness. But Moses didn't stop there, because we talked about 5 excuses. Exodus 4:13, Moses pleaded again. I love this. He says, Lord, please send anyone else. At this point, Moses was like, God, I don't want to do it. Send anybody else. Anybody else can do this. But it doesn't stop there in the Bible with excuses. We keep going. Let's go to Judges chapter 6. God calls Gideon to rescue Israel from the Midianites. Judges 6:15 doesn't take long for Gideon to give an excuse. He says, can I rescue Israel? How can I? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family. Man, I've often thought a lot that, I'm the weakest that God could possibly choose. God could so choose someone better than me. Anyone else ever felt that way before? It's like an all the time feeling. But God chose him, and Gideon did amazing things. Let's keep going. Jeremiah the prophet. Did y'all know Jeremiah came up with an excuse? In Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 6, when God called him, Jeremiah replied, O sovereign Lord, I can't speak for you. I'm too young. Even Jeremiah came up with an excuse for God. Now I really like this next excuse. This next excuse is so cool to me that he didn't even give words. He didn't even give words with his excuse. Let's look at Jonah. Jonah, God told Jonah to go to Nineveh and tell them about their destruction coming. I think when I counted it up in this translation, he only had to say like 8 or 9 words. That's all that the Bible documented that he said. But here's what Jonah did. In Jonah 1, chapter 3, it says, but Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. Boy, I've been there. Anybody else? I've been there. Jonah didn't just not say anything. He ran away. He ran away. I can see now how foolish it is to try to run away from God, because I don't care where we go, we're not going to run away from God. That can't happen. There's nowhere we can go to run away from him. So Jonah went down to the port of Joppa, where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape the Lord by sailing to somewhere else the Lord made. Really? What an excuse. The Bible is full of people who made an excuse, just like us today. But the good thing about every one of these excuses that was made that we just talked about, God answered every single one of them and equipped every single one of them to go do what he asked them to go do. The one thing that I've noticed about excuses, and this might be because now I'm in a position of leadership with my job, is I get a lot of excuses every day. I get a lot of them. You know, some of them I'm okay with, and some of them I'm like, really? But it seems that excuses they're becoming more and more commonplace. And unfortunately, it kind of seems that excuses are becoming more and more commonplace within the church. I'm not talking about First Baptist, I'm talking about God's people, the church. We seem to get more comfortable with giving excuses to God. As we give one excuse, it gets easier to give the next one, right? It's almost like a lie. Once you tell one lie, you got to keep telling a lie, and then it just gets easier to tell a lie. It's kind of the same thing with excuses. You know, you give God one excuse, and you look around, and you're like, okay, everything seems to be going okay. I can give him another one. But I'll get to it eventually. Or maybe just like you keep going and giving excuses and giving and making excuses that eventually it becomes like second nature, which I think it kind of has for a lot of folks. Making excuses not to go do God's work has become almost like a second nature to us. It kind of almost seems like that's our first knee-jerk reaction when God calls us to do something, is to make an excuse sometimes. Because I'm going to tell you this, everything that we just talked about in the verses we just read, like those things that God called those people to do, they were pretty hard to do. God didn't expect them to do it all by themselves. He expected them to lean on Him and rely on Him to go do it. And that's where we mess up things today. I know when God calls us to do stuff. I know when God first called me to preach. I'm not sure if I've shared that with you. The first time I ever spoke, I'm going to share it with you this morning. My dad was preacher at Friendship Baptist Church, and he had a stroke preaching. He says that he had asked God, he had prayed to God to give him more time. Well, God answered the prayer in the form of a stroke. He was out 6 months and got plenty of study time. So I told myself, God, I've got plenty of time. I'm good. We'll make those 24 hours a day work. We'll stretch them out. So the first time I ever had the opportunity to speak, the dad and the deacons of the church were asking people to come around and share their testimony. And they got to me. And you know what my first response was? No. And I think I probably said it just like that, with that same look on my face. And if you could see capital letters come out of my mouth with about 3 exclamation points, that's what you got. I was no hands down. I'm not going to get up there and share my testimony. No, I'm not going to get up there and talk in front of a bunch of people, even though I knew every one of them. Even though I probably acted a fool in front of some of them, I wasn't going to get up there and speak. Because honestly, it's kind of intimidating when you get up in front of your peers to speak. It is. It's hard. And if I had to rely on myself to do it, I'd be up here stumbling over my words just like Moses would. Or at least he said he would. So this went on, and one by one, different men of the church on Sundays stood up and gave their testimony. I'm watching, I'm listening, I'm watching, and God started speaking to me. He's like, you need to share your testimony. You need to share what I'm doing in your life right now. I'm like, no, I can't. So Sunday went. I don't know how many Sundays we did it for. It might have been 1 to 3, I don't remember. But somewhere in the middle of that, I'm driving to my mom's house here in New Brockton. And I'm crossing the Pea River Bridge in Elba. And God just got a hold of me. He said, you're going to share your testimony. I said, no, one more time. And then that was it. God got so hard a hold of me that by the time I was at my mom's house, I was in tears praying to God to forgive me because I had been disobedient for what He told me to go do. So I called my dad and I said, I want to share my testimony. I don't know if it was the next Sunday or the next Sunday after that, I got up and I did it. And literally at church, I was like this. Hi. Yeah, that's kind of how I was. It was so nerve-wracking. But after I was done sharing what God had been doing in my life, little did I know at that point right there, God was calling me to deeper waters. He was calling me on to bigger things. And that was the first step. There was such a peace about it after that. Was I any better at public speaking? Oh, no. No, I wasn't. Am I any better at public speaking now? Maybe a fraction. Not much. But when God calls us, certain things, they start going through our minds. An example of that would be like, God, you don't know what you're doing calling on somebody like me. And I think about that today, and I've thought that. I have been that person that has thought that. That God, what are you thinking calling me? The real question should be like, who am I to doubt what you do? Come on. Who am I to doubt what you're doing? Another thing that might go through your mind is when God calls you and you go out to do what He says is, why should anyone listen to me? I'm really just a nobody. There's nothing important about me. I'm not even good. I am literally a nobody. That's okay. You know why that's okay? Because when I go out to share the gospel, when I go out to do works for the kingdom, I don't want people to see me. That's right. I want people to see Jesus in me. That's right. I don't need them to see me. So thank God I am a nobody, so Jesus can be somebody. Another thing you might say, Lord, I just don't have what it takes. That's true. I don't. But He does. I love this one, okay? I've said this one. God, I'm just not good enough. Anyone ever said that? Oh, man. God, I'm just not good enough. Spoiler alert, church. We never will be without Jesus. How about this one? God, I don't have time. I'm too busy. Just shared what happened with my dad when he said that. I can relate to that. I can. I understand what it's like to be busy. I understand what it's like to feel like you don't have any time. But it's amazing what God can do with the same amount of time that you have. What you can't do with it. It's so amazing to see what He can do. It's like He takes that time and He stretches it out. I don't know how He does it. He made it, so maybe He can do it. I've used that excuse before. And there are many, many other excuses that I'm sure I've come up with. These were just a few that I could think of off the top of my head. There might be some different excuses that maybe you've used before. I don't know. But have you ever noticed that when we make excuses, we kind of make excuses based on our own strengths and weaknesses? I'm not a public speaker. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I think I've shared this before. My first time public speaking, I wanted to pass out. I was in 11th grade. I had to recite a poem, which I knew front and back. But for some reason, I get up there in front of the class, and all I could remember was the name of it and who wrote it. God calls us to do these things. He equips us to do them. And we got to change the way that we look at the things that God calls us to do. Paul, he gives us a little bit of a different perspective. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul talks about how he was given a thorn in his flesh. Now, we don't know exactly what that thorn was, but we do know that it hindered him. And Paul said he got that from keeping him from becoming too proud. He also calls it a messenger from Satan to torment him, to keep him from becoming too proud. So whatever this thorn was, it really hindered Paul. Okay? And to hinder Paul, I would have to think it would have to be pretty bad. Paul was a mighty man of God. And if he said, hang on a minute, God, I can't do this. Because you know what the scripture says in 2 Corinthians 12, chapter 12, verse 8? It says, 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. On 3 separate occasions, Paul begged God, Lord, take this away from me. But I love God's response. Because each time Paul pleaded with God, he begged with him to take it away, God said, my grace is all you need. Amen. My power works best in weakness. Why do you think I called you to go do it? Because you're weak here and I want you to be strong, and you're going to be strong in me. So Paul said, so now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses. Paul said he takes pleasure in his weaknesses. Wow. That's cool. He takes pleasure in the weaknesses and in the insults that he endured. The hardships. I don't know if you know, but Paul went through a lot in his life. Almost at every turn and later in his life, he went through a hardship. He went through an insult. He was persecuted, and he had a lot of trouble. And that's exactly what he said. That he said he takes great pleasure in those weaknesses, not because he went through it, but because Christ was shown and glorified in that time that he was going through it.
That's right. Come on.
He said, I take pleasure in all those things, that I suffer for Christ, for when I am weak, I am strong. Wow. We got to change our perspectives when God calls us to do something. If I had a title of this message, it would be called, What's Your Excuse? I get that a lot. But I don't think that should be the title that we should stick with. I think the title that we should stick with is something a little bit different. How about, do we want to continue making excuses, or do we want to make a difference? When God calls us, He wants to use us to bring Him glory, to share His word, and to bring people to Him so that they can have the same saving grace that we have. And I can promise you, when people receive that free gift of salvation, a difference has been made in their life. Probably the biggest difference they're ever going to have. And you ask, what? I'm talking about the difference between hell and heaven. That's what I'm talking about. You can't make a bigger difference in some person's life than to share the plan of salvation with them. They can't make a bigger difference in their life than accepting that free gift of salvation. That's an eternal difference, church. That's not a temporary difference. That's an eternal difference. That's the difference that God has allowed you to make. He used you to make that in someone's life. An eternal difference. So the question this morning, are we going to continue to make excuses, church, or are we going to start making a difference? That's the question. I'm sure that if you're like me, you can probably think of more than 100 times that you've made an excuse. I'm sure there's times that we probably didn't even realize we were making excuses, and we did. Whether it be to a friend or a family member, or better yet, to God, we've probably done it. He's probably called us out of that boat more than one time. Are we going to be like Peter and take that first step out of that boat, or are we going to stay in there and be afraid? God didn't give us a spirit of fear. That's right. He gave us the spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. And not for us just to sit on that. That's right. He didn't. He gave us that to go out and to use it for His glory. So that when we're weak, He can be shown and we can be strong in Him. This morning, if you look on the side of the pews, you'll see some envelopes and some pens and an index card or a couple. Every one of us, like I said before, have been making excuses. And there might be a few excuses that we cling to. I'm going to go ahead and say, my excuse is I don't have time. That's my biggest one right there. So maybe you've had an excuse in your life that you've used a lot. Or maybe you actually find security in that excuse when God calls you. You think that maybe it justifies or gives you a reason not to go do what God's called you to do. So this morning, on those index cards, I want to encourage you. Write that excuse down. I want to encourage you. Write it down on that index card. If you have more than one, write them both down. If you've got 5 or 6, write them all down. God didn't call us to make an excuse. Once you get that done, during the time of our invitation, you don't have to stand up today. So I want you thinking and praying today. And I want you talking to God. I want you to say, God, where are my excuses at in my life? What am I making excuses in? What excuses have I given you? Because once you got them down on that index card, I want you to seal them up in that envelope. Now here's the hard part, church. Once they're sealed up in that envelope, I want to encourage you to come drop them at the altar. Because those are excuses that we're no longer going to make. When God calls us, we should go. Because I can tell you this, He wouldn't have called you if He had someone else in mind to go do what He called you to do. So this morning, as the invitation plays, I want to ask you, do you want to continue making excuses? Or do you want to make a difference? Let's get rid of our excuses this morning. As the music plays, you respond.